Our ability to create community is undisputed. We are interconnected as a mosaic, regardless of our ethnicities, and Ascend is about togetherness.
Welcome to API Futures, a podcast by Ascend where we empower global leaders of tomorrow. Here's our guest host for this episode.
Hello. Hello.
Hey.
My name is Jeff Yang, and I want to welcome you guys to the first ever live taping of API Futures. I'm so excited to be here in this incredible room full of people as part of this opening plenary / again, live podcast recording. I don't know how much you may know about me. I am an author, a cultural critic, a pop culture expert, and I'm the father of Hudson Yang from Fresh Off the Boat. The only title people call me by these days, and I'm grateful to be in conversation today with, frankly, a legend. Helen Zia is an award-winning journalist, author, social justice activist, and frankly, a longtime friend and companion on the journey in this community. When Vincent Chin was murdered in 1982 by two white men during an era of anti-Asian hate, the perpetrators received only 3 years probation and a $3,000 fine. Helen Zia, through her journalism and advocacy, galvanized the Asian American community and a mass movement that resulted in bringing federal civil rights charges against the perpetrators, marking the first time in U.S. history that the government acted on behalf of an Asian American in a civil rights case.
Right. First time.
Helen, what an honor to have you here in this gathering on this stage. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm honored to be on stage with you and all the work you've been doing.
Father of Hudson Yang.
Well, no, we are Bruce, all the work, A Magazine founder, and I just want to say, I think I first met you when you just got out of college.
Yes, those were the days. But the days continue. And I want to actually go back to your early days to begin this conversation. Before you actually found your voice and your passion as a journalist and as an advocate, you actually did other things first. Like many of us, you changed careers. I, at one point, was going to be a doctor, as many in this room probably were. Helen, what were some of the things you did before you took up the torch, as it were?
Well, I've had an opportunity to spend a little bit of time today talking to people, meeting some who I see here, and knowing that, and hearing your questions to the different panels, and knowing that many of you either currently work in or maybe grew up in areas that didn't have a lot of other people who look like you. I heard people talking about being the only one, and that's how I grew up. I grew up before the 1965 Immigration Act and seeing the real change and growth of our communities. So, being a kid in school, there were two other Asian American, both Chinese American families in my little town in New Jersey. And, it was assumed one of the families was mine, and it was assumed that the kids in my family were going to marry the kids in the other family because we were the only ones, And so the things that I did, my family had a little business in our house. And we kids and my mom and dad would make stuff in our house. And my dad would, when he felt like it, pile up the car, fill it with stuff, and sell it to flower shops. So I actually started working when I was about 5. And from then, the things that I did were just trying to figure out, how do I make a living in America, which I think I've heard a lot here too.
You worked in a dry cleaners, a donut shop.
Right.
You were it says you're a lobotomist, but I'm pretty sure that's wrong.
Yeah, no, I was not a lobotomist. I was a phlebotomist. So what that is the people who draw your blood when you go get blood tests.
Yes.
And so I did that on the way to being in medical school, which when I left college, it was, my whole goal was to get to college. And it wasn't, what am I going to do after that? And in those days, there wasn't an Ascend. There wasn't anything that said you could do something besides doctor, lawyer, business, or teacher. And being terribly afraid of speaking in public like this back then, I just knew, okay, doctor, a lawyer and teacher were out of the question. And that left, and business was my dad and us making stuff in our house. You know, I didn't know about all these corporations. And so, you know, like a lot of kids of immigrants, it was like, okay, medical school, let me see if I can hack that. And the thing was, I should have figured out that in college when I, you know, majored in history and sociology and public affairs and things like that, and took the minimum number of medical, you know, school requirements, I actually got into medical school.
Wow.
And so when I got there, and within 2 weeks, I realized, you know, Helen, you've made a really big mistake. This is not the kind of change you want to make in America. And then it took me 2 years to actually tell my parents, you know, who by then were like, our daughter, the doctor, she'll take care of us when we're old. And so, I mean, I know a lot of kids of immigrants here, refugees, you know, your parents' pension plans. And so that's what we were. And so my goal of trying to just, you know, make some money, be able to send some money home. So I did a lot of really weird jobs. But the main thing was after I quit medical school, I knew I wanted to do something in community and be an organizer. And what did that mean? Well, I still needed to work. I actually got a job as a construction laborer at a time when men of color, let alone women, were not admitted into construction jobs. And just by comparison, a construction laborer back then in the 1970s could make $10 an hour. Minimum wage was $1.50 an hour.
Wow.
So, you know, it changed my life being able to dig ditches actually for a while. And then a friend said, if you really want to know about social change in America, you should go to the heartland of America. And I know many of you work or grew up in the heartland of America. And growing up in New Jersey, you know, moving to Michigan and then getting a job in the auto industry. And I know the first speaker today worked in automotive. I got a job at Chrysler Corporation as a large press operator with the intent of really just trying to know about what motivates people, you know, to work at jobs that are really difficult, you know, where they're not appreciated, where bad things happen, and where they have to unionize in order to even have a voice. And so that's why I went there, to understand. But that's what brought me to Detroit when another time of anti-Asian hate happened in the 1980s, similar to what happened during the pandemic and even today. And so,
let's paint the picture for that. So I'm sure most of you have heard about the case of Vincent Chin, about his killing and how that changed the direction of Asian America and our movement.
Let's see, just a show of hands, how many of you have ever even heard of Vincent Chin?
All right.
Okay, well, a fair number.
Fair number.
And some who haven't. So.
Just painting the picture, this was a time when the auto industry, which was, of course, the lifeblood, continues to be the lifeblood of jobs and the economy in Detroit and a major industry in the United States, of course, was being challenged by imports from Japan. And there were actually, at the time, public displays where people were like beating Toyotas with sledgehammers. And there was rhetoric from both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, basically talking about how those blankety-blank people from across the ocean were stealing our jobs, were destroying America. These are very familiar phrases if you guys are listening.
And that we should send another atomic bomb over to Japan. I mean, it was quite violent and in the words of war.
Well, those words and those images flooding the news waves ended up creating an environment, essentially, where it was almost like a gasoline tank waiting to explode. And it did explode. And it occurred when a young man who was actually celebrating his impending wedding, it was his bachelor party, went out for a night, encountered two out-of-work auto workers.
Actually, they weren't out of work, but they were auto workers.
Two auto workers, not yet out of work, but who nevertheless projected the issues that the auto industry were having on him, saying basically it's because of you guys that our industry is
right.
collapsing.
It's because of you mother Fs that we are out of work. Fighting words, and this is the groom to be. It's his party, and so after that, Vincent Chin was not a shrinking violet. He stood up and he fought the guy who called him an MF. And from there, those guys chased him through the streets of Detroit, had a baseball bat. Vincent and his Chinese friend, there were other white friends who were part of the party. They were not chased, but the two men sort of found them while they were sitting waiting for a bus to get away, and then caught Vincent Chin, smashed his head in with a baseball bat in front of about 70 witnesses, including 2 off-duty cops who drew their guns and forced him to stop. And so that's who got probation, the 2 men for beating Vincent Chin to death with a baseball bat.
And the judge who actually delivered that pronouncement that they would only receive a $3,000 fine and probation literally said, these aren't the types of people you put in jail. These aren't bad people. Yes, they killed this guy with a baseball bat.
But they won't do it again because they have good jobs. Now, all of you here, part of your career is just imagine if you went out and beat somebody to death with a baseball bat and they said, oh, well, you're employed with a reputable company. You have a steady job. It's okay. Or if this happened to a member of your family. So when the judge said that, and you have to remember, this was in Detroit. The 2 killers were 2 white men. He said, these are not the kind of men you send to jail. Well, in a city that was majority black, then who do you send to jail? And so it just created a huge uproar that was, had a lot of multiracial presence, but Asian Americans who at that point had not even come together as the different Asian ethnicities, like the Pan-Asian gathering today. We didn't have Pan-Asian gatherings. It was like you're Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Indian, all of and nobody identified, except for activists, as Asian American. That was the point where people said, each of us are small populations in Detroit, but we have to come together in order to have a voice. And even when we came together, we knew we didn't have a large voice, but we also reached out. Today is a theme of allyship. We had incredibly strong allies within the Black community among every church you can imagine and religion in the Detroit area, among the large Arab American community. And so it was really a civil rights movement that started in Detroit, of all places, led by, organized by Asian Americans.
And you ended up being at the center of that because there was a need for somebody to essentially communicate with the press, to be a liaison with the family, the mother of Vincent Chin, grieving mother after Vincent's passing, and to essentially ensure that the world, and not just Detroit, could see what was happening. The reason why we're talking about this today is because right around the time of the 40th anniversary of Vincent's killing, the FBI actually just released over 600 pages of documents that had been sealed from the Vincent Chin case. And you've had the chance to actually look at those papers. Obviously, it was a kind of nostalgia, not necessarily a pleasant one. But what were some of the things you saw in there, and why are they relevant today?
Oh, unfortunately, it's still very, very relevant today. And just to go back about like how I got involved, I want to say I was a brand new journalist. I was just entering the journalism field. I had my first permanent, regular full-time journalism job after being an independent contractor, a freelance writer for a while to get to that job. And back then we were told, you don't get involved. And so, many of you might think, well, should I get involved in something that's happening in my community? How will that affect my work? And so I was one of the few Asian American journalists at that time in Detroit. I knew how to write a press release. I knew about communications. I knew how to organize a press conference. And I had to make a decision, do I get involved? And I did. And there were times when I actually wrote things that I had to use. Thanks. And I had one of those awkward meetings with my boss because I was actually showing up on TV, and he called me into his office and he said, I know what you're doing and I know why. And I can't say I agree with you that Vincent Chin was the target of racism toward Asians, but he said, I'm not going to stop you, but the thing is you can never write about this for our publication. So what I did was I continued, being writing press releases, doing all that stuff, eventually becoming a spokesperson. But when I did write about it in my community, I used a pseudonym, and it worked. I mean, it was fine. I didn't lose my job. I didn't end my career. And I just want to say, for many people in Ascend, you have incredible skills, and for those of you, even, let's say, in audit and accounting, I can't tell you how many nonprofit community organizations need your help, because they may not have those skills in order to, just keep the books clean. And they want to, but they don't know how. So those are things you can volunteer and do to really advance these groups. But to the point about the 602 pages that the FBI dumped on the community, you can read any of these because it's on the FBI website. And if you just Google FBI Vincent Chin, you'll see it. But so when they did it on the anniversary week that Vincent Chin was killed, which is, as far as we know, a coincidence. But, it's interesting to see, like 10 years of my life all concentrated in these 602 documents. And by the way, they're probably going to have another batch coming out too. But the main thing I'll say about them, besides the FBI investigators' notes, different court things, the eyewitnesses' statements, you can see how those are done. But what you can really see, if you look with a critical eye, they also had all of the news coverage, all in one place, covering a number of years. And what you can see is, how did people view Asian Americans then in 1982? What did media, who at that time were all white men covering the first civil rights trial involving an Asian American, what was their view about that? Now, the killers actually, witnesses heard them say, it's because of you mother Fs that we're out of work. Well, if you parse that, none of that contains a single racist word, right? And so in the eventual trials that happened, it was viewed that, well, actually that wasn't, that was not a racial motivation. And so anyway, that was definitely contested by the Asian American community, but still, that was the end result of it. And I want to say, seeing how that was even defended for these reporters to say, well, really, here's this trial. We have to cover this trial. So they said it's because of you mother Fs that we're out of work. So some of his friends heard them say, racial slurs about Chinese, of Japanese. One of those reporters actually wrote an op-ed piece where he said, well, I really never thought there was racism involved, because you get some drunk men in a room together at a bar, and some of the men might be of Asian. Well, what are you going to call them? Of course, if they were Jewish, you would call them a Jewish anti-Semitic slur. Or if it was somebody fat, you would say, hey, fat boy, and then beat him up and kill him, And
boys will be boys.
Yeah, and he actually wrote this, and you can just see how that dominated the view. Now, what does that have to do with today? You think about what happened in Atlanta. And the first police response the day after the terrible shooting there that killed 8 people, including 6 Asian American women, by a killer who sought them out. They said, this has nothing to do with race. And actually, I do have this publication here that the Vincent Chin Institute has put together that you can find on vincentchin.org. But we actually list a number of the terrible killings really that have happened. It wasn't just Vincent Chin. The 1980s, I have to say, and even part of the 90s were a killing decade for Asian Americans. And I'm sorry to say, I believe we are in a time like that today, which is why groups like Ascend, why your ERGs are so important. But you look at today and you think, and talking about microaggressions, what are the words that have to be said that would rise to the level of people thinking, oh yeah, that's an anti-Asian racism kind of thing. I have to tell you, after being somebody involved in this space for a long time, I don't really think there are any words, even the worst words we can think of, that I've heard many times directed at me, or people who look like me, or, it's not enough. The people who on the ground have to decide, oh, is this a civil rights matter? is it's a hate crime. It's the police on the ground and the prosecutors, the same kind of people we saw in Atlanta who said, oh no, this is nothing. He was just having a bad day. Well, what words are necessary? And in fact, we don't need to have words. What if they say nothing? The point is that we know when we're in a room when it feels, okay, this could be dicey. This doesn't feel safe. I'm worried about, grandma and grandpa walking in this neighborhood, or something like that, right? And so this is where we are. It is not that different from 42 years ago. And I think that's one of the challenges we have as Asian Americans. Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and groups like Ascend need to be aware of that if you're talking about microaggressions or you're talking about what's going on in your community and being worried about your kids walking to school or after school, what time are they going to come home, or a mom and dad going for walks or, any of those things. We have to be able to recognize where we are today. And part of it is we are still invisible. Even what would it take to make it very clear, short of membership in a white supremacist organization or the KKK or something like that, short of membership, what would it take to actually convince non-Asians that there might actually be ill will toward people who look like us?
Well, the critical term in that statement that was spoken basically over the body of Vincent Chin, it's because of people like you people, right, is to me something emblematic of something that we're seeing in America today. This notion of us versus them. And if you've listened to the rhetoric that's being emitted currently by a certain political party, they, them, those on the outside, the people who don't belong here, the poison in our midst, those are all ideas and rhetoric that are being reinforced again and again. And increasingly, that rhetoric is being aimed not just south, but around the world. We know that China, obviously, is a common or collective nemesis that is being raised perpetually whenever America is challenged economically or otherwise. We know that this election, regardless of how things go, is going to be another one in which China is being framed as the great enemy. All of that redounds upon Asians in America. And there is a sense in which, at this point, this notion of being them'd and they'd, the only real defense we have for it is to be able to define ourselves and not be defined as others by others. So in your career and in the work that you've done, both as a journalist and as a spokesperson, what would you say as advice to people about how to ensure that they too can define for themselves who they are, both as Asian Americans and in every other aspect of their lives?
Well, I think number one is to do it, to speak up, to take the lessons and the advice that I heard some of the leaders and speakers here earlier today, and I'm sure the previous 2 days, I heard the words, be a DEI activist, to be an advocate in your companies, to come together. And, I've heard people say being here and seeing people, 2,000 people who are, it just gives us energy and strength and the ability to go back inspired and make change and be that DEI activist. Well, that's what we have to do, not just in the workplace, but when you think about how invisible or disrespected or small we may feel at work and how Ascend helps make that, see a path for change. If the larger society also treats us with invisibility and disempowered, the workplace is just one part of our lives, but it's, what affects the workplace is the larger society. So I don't really see a lot of separation, but I think what you're learning and the leadership, the whole leadership and coaching and things like that are being talked about here have to be translated in a broader sense into society, into your homes, into your, having that talk with your families, with your kids. Why do we need to figure out a way to speak up? People will maybe make fun of you. They might say something. Of course, it has to be age appropriate when you have these conversations, but being prepared. I mean, if you know you're in a situation where there are people who make comments that are microaggressions, part of it is organizing. Be prepared to have a comeback with that. You know, I say to people, if you hear something, you might not have the perfect thing to say. And as Asian Americans, we're often like, okay, let me think. Should I say this? Should I say that? And by the time you're done with it, the moment passes. You know, you can be prepared and just say, you know, I want to think about this, but I want to tell you, I don't agree with what you said. I don't support that. And I think there are other people who agree. You know, I hope you'll allow me to have another conversation with you at some point. And so we can be prepared for things like that. But we have to speak up because nobody's going to do it for us. I do want to say that over time, if we look at history, we are at a time different from the 1980s when Black, Asian, Latinx, Black, brown, red, yellow, white people came together. In that 40 years, there's been just a lot of activity to try to divide and conquer and create scapegoats. China, as you know, most Americans can't name a single Asian American, right? When those surveys, you know, when they're asked, can you name a single one? The most common, as somebody who's been influential in your life, the most common answer is don't know. That's the most common Asian American that most other Americans can name. The second is Bruce Lee, and he's been dead a long time.
Yeah.
And the third is Jackie Chan, and he's not even Asian American, right? But when they're asked, what is the existential threat to America? No question, China. And many of them can't even find China on a map, you know, or differentiate Taiwan from Thailand. Right. I mean, that's the reality. So we have to be those ambassadors for ourselves and for our communities. Because if we don't, then I'm sorry to say, things will not change. That it's an imperative. We have to.
I love that so much, the idea of being an ambassador for your community and for yourself. In many ways, there's like a progression there, right? There's the notion of allyship. We need to reach out and ensure that we're actually there for other people. We need to be upstanders, not just bystanders. We need to be willing to put ourselves in the path of injustice, of things that are potentially causing harm to ourselves or to others. But then being an ambassador, that really means going and stepping across borders and being somebody who can essentially not just incidentally be there, but build relationships for the long haul. So if there's anything I think that Ascend really represents in this conference and in all the work that you guys do, it is this notion that each and every one of us, well, we're forced to be representatives because of our faces, because of our names. We're forced to be representatives of our communities. So why don't we actually do that on purpose? Why don't we be those ambassadors that we're always asked to be regardless? Thank you guys so much. It's been a great conversation. I have one last question. One last question. And this is one which I think is, sort of like the lightning round question, perhaps. It's one that we ask at the end of every single podcast episode, and it's this. Looking back at the impact of your career, what advice would you give to your younger self?
I'm thinking about what you just said about being upstanders, not just bystanders, and speaking up. And I think in my early years, I didn't know what it meant to be Asian American. The Asian American movement was still just something in progress. Our numbers were, now we have 24 million Asian Americans, and we're 6% of the American population. People say 6% is so low. Back then we were like 1/1000th of a percent. And that made me not have a lot of self-esteem and pride. And I see that sometimes today about, just can we stand tall? Can we walk as though we are part of this country? Other Asian Americans have walked here through Las Vegas 100 years ago before, and that we can walk in their path. We stand on their shoulders. We belong here. Yes. And we should walk and talk as though we do, to speak up, to when we're in a meeting, to project our voices, to not be the quiet one that people are going, what did she say? And so if I could say that to my younger self, it would be that, to not be afraid to look people in the eye. And when I see another Asian American, to nod and smile. When I was, acknowledge each other and not look away and do that Asian flinch, And so all of that, I would say to my younger self, be proud of who you are. Be proud of the people you work with and other community and your family, and show your pride. Stand up tall. It took me a long time to get to that point, and to even be able to say to people who are not Asian, hey, how are you? To be in the elevator and like, how's it going? Today I saw some guy and I said, he was in shorts. Is it hot out there today? And to not be afraid to have those conversations. I was when I was a lot younger. And I have to say, I think it was a transformation. It took time, but we have the numbers now. We have the voices. We have the TV, creatives out there. It really does take us to first start here and to say, we belong here. And I'm going to act that way. I want you to know that. And if you don't, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you how. Let me show you. Let me tell you about my American life. And so I think that's what I would say to my younger self.
Well,
Thank you.
we are very, very, very fortunate that you found your voice and that you found yourself in a position where you can tell all of our younger selves, all of our currently young selves, hopefully, exactly what we should be doing into the future. Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you guys for joining us, and have a great remainder of the conference.
Thanks to all of you. And if I can say, go to vincenttchin.org, because it tells all about how you can do this, or your community. And if I might make that suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to API Futures, presented by Ascend, where we empower global leaders of tomorrow. Subscribe to API Futures on Spotify, Amazon Music, and Apple.